and I'm pleased to be moderating this program. We have some great speakers. First, we're going to hear from Taylor Perlman, who had been at the Albany Law School Rural Law Initiative. I'm going to give her a full introduction in just a minute, as well as Chief Justice David Gilbertson of the South Dakota Supreme Court, and Suzanne Starr, who's the Director of Policy and Legal Services at the South Dakota Unified Judicial System. They're going to be joining us in just a couple of minutes, we hope. And in the interim, though, we're going to get started. In the event that you have any questions for any of the panelists, you should have at the bottom of your screen a little thing that says Q&A, and feel free to type your question in there. We will be monitoring those and making sure that they can be presented to the panelists for questions, probably closer to the end of the program, but feel free at any time to add a question to that. In addition, in the chat area, you are going to find a link to a report that was written by our panelist, Taylor Perlman, while she was at Albany Law School. It is the Rural Law Practice in New York State report, and it is one of the first of its kind to show very in-depth both qualitative and quantitative data regarding rural law practices. So to start this off, I'm going to start with a slide that will show you what things look like in North Dakota, which is one of our most rural states. This was from an article in a recent newspaper, which showed that the concentration of lawyers in North Dakota was within 2 to 4 states, leaving almost the entirety of the rest of the state, which is a considerable distance, without any lawyers whatsoever. And the same article also had a screen that showed what things were like for the United States. Now, you'll probably see that New York is pretty darn green in that it has, this is all the states outside the District of Columbia, that it has the largest concentration of lawyers of any state in the country. And you can click on your own state and see what the representation of number of lawyers is. But if you look at a chart that we have of New York, you will see that while New York might have 92 lawyers per thousand, that most of them are concentrated in New York County, which is where Manhattan is. There are a few other counties with larger concentration, leaving the great majority of the 62 counties of New York without much in the way of legal representation. And that's what brings us, I think, to Taylor's presentation. Taylor is a graduate of the Brooklyn Law School, which was her hometown, but she gained a real appreciation for rural living when, after the bar exam, she decided to spend some time on a biodiverse organic farm. She just left the Rural Law Initiative from the government law center at Albany Law School, and she is now at Hudson Valley Legal Aid. And she is also the co-chair of the task force on rural law initiatives of the New York State Bar Association. And we're going to start this off with Taylor giving a summary of the report that she's the author of. And again, that report, we provided a link to you in the chat area, and feel free to download the report and look at it at your leisure. Tayer, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sharon. So I'm very excited to be a part of this group and to share with you all the really interesting research that I've been doing within a jurisdiction that seems to not be one targeted for issues with rural access to attorneys, particularly when we compare it to some of the other jurisdictions that have so much less attorneys, but it's quite surprising how few of those attorneys actually practice in the rural counties of New York State. I just took a deep dive into this because doing my work through the Rural Law Initiative, which made me become a traveling attorney, where I was going to rural counties and offering legal assistance to rural businesses. And hearing the anecdotal tales that people were telling me about how difficult it was for them to find an attorney where they live. And I started trying to get a better sense of what was happening and was not able to find any data on it. And being that I was in an academic institution through the Rural Law Initiative, I was like, well, let me take this on as a research project, particularly when so many other jurisdictions in the United States have already been doing this kind of deep data work in their jurisdictions to understand the composition of their bars and where attorneys were located. And I took a lot of insight from the trailblazing work of South Dakota and my California, where my mentor, Lisa Pruitt, does a lot of this kind of work and has done a similar study in Arkansas. This kind of information is incredibly empowering and important because it allows the bar to really understand the legal trends that are happening within its jurisdiction. I was surprised that this was going to be a first of its kind survey of rural practitioners in New York State, which is what I did. I took the Office of Court Administration data, their tremendously large list of registered New York State attorneys, and I culled it down to the rural counties. New York State has 62 counties, and I believe we narrowed it down to, I don't remember the exact number, but I think it was like 42 of those counties were considered rural. And from that, we knew that there were 5,257 attorneys that had rural county addresses listed in that data set. That makes up only 3% of New York State licensed attorneys. So even though New York State has the largest amount of registered attorneys of any jurisdiction, of that amount, only 3% are serving the majority of the state and its landmass. It was incredibly illuminating to reach out to these attorneys. The survey was administered between August and October of 2018, and we had roughly 900 responses, but of those responses, we only analyzed 500, the exact number, it's all, 573 were the amount we analyzed. And the reason why is because the survey was really focusing on access to justice and which licensed attorneys in those rural counties were actually offering legal services to the public. Many licensed attorneys don't necessarily do that with their law degrees, and we were really trying to see how many folks were actually providing legal services. One caveat about the survey that we ran was that only the number of people that responded and whose answers we analyzed only represent 11% of the total amount of rurally registered attorneys. But that's still a statistically significant number to tell us legal trends that we could then say mean something across the board. I'm just going to share a few significant statistics from that survey, which no doubt is something very similar happening in other jurisdictions. There's an incredible piece out. It's a law review article by Lisa Pruitt and a number of other academics across multiple law schools that study 5 different jurisdictions across the United States, which I highly recommend you all take a look at if you're interested in this topic. And after this presentation, I'll forward out that law review article that takes a deep dive into the legal trends of attorneys in rural counties within those jurisdictions. And there really is the similar things happening across the board. So we can learn a lot from other jurisdictions and the studies that they do on this topic. One of the primary things that came out of this survey were a number of facts that indicated a shortage of lawyers in many of these rural counties. Was that many reported the strain of a high volume of cases. 40% of them reported that they handle 100+ cases a year, and 24% reported that they handle 76 to 100 cases a year. This demonstrates that there really is a high need for their services, and they were overloaded with the caseload. Another factor that indicates the shortage, particularly in the near future, is that 74.3%, that's nearly 3/4 of everyone that was surveyed, reported being 45 years or older. And 54% indicated that they were going to be retiring soon. And that's very concerning, particularly coupled with the qualitative data where the respondents indicated that they have a hard time hiring associates or finding someone to take over their practice, because effectively in 5 to 30 years, more than half of the currently registered rural practitioners are not going to be there, and there's nobody coming to replace them. So that's going to accelerate the access to justice crisis happening in these communities. Another significant point that came out of the survey was the prevalence of indigent clients in rural counties. 76.3% agree that rural clients often cannot afford legal services or couldn't pay the full bill for their services. And that nearly 1/3 indicated that they have to decline cases because the client cannot afford their services. This again boils down to the access to justice issue, very prevalent in rural communities. I'm going to stop there and just check in with Sharon, because I could go on like this for a long time, and I want to make sure that everyone has space in this program to say what they have to say. But I just did want to alert you all that the report, which has been shared, is filled with really phenomenal qualitative responses from the respondents that really show a very human portrait of both the rewards and challenges that a rural practitioner faces wherever they happen to be. In this case, these are rural practitioners in New York, but I'm sure that many of the same rewards and challenges manifest in other jurisdictions, and I urge you all to take a look at it, because that qualitative data from our respondents was one of the most touching things that I've read in my legal career. So I urge you all to read it.
Thank you, Taylor. I wonder if you can comment a little bit about some of the reasons that young lawyers gave why they found it very difficult, either why they perhaps tried rural practice and left back for the city, or were reluctant to come to rural communities at all.
Yes, so actually there were a number of responses that talked about leaving the city and practicing in rural communities and loving it much more than urban practice. But the main reported deterrent for why young attorneys were not going back home to practice was primarily due to law school debt. The reality of graduating with such a tremendous amount of debt makes it very difficult for an individual to take on the risk of moving to a rural location where they may be paid less than a firm in the city, even if the cost of living is low, and that would equalize that salary differential. Because of the tremendous law school debt, they are deterred from taking on that risk, and also like the lack of stability involved in running your own practice, where you aren't necessarily getting paid a steady, constant salary that you can depend on to help you budget and pay your law school debt, is another primary deterrent, I believe. And that was reported by a number of practitioner or respondents in the qualitative answers, saying, I have a hard time keeping an associate. Many of them end up leaving because of law school debt.
Did you also come across a difficulty for all of the participants with respect to things like travel time, and perhaps the need for greater technology, and perhaps the use within the courts of video conferencing as an alternative to trying to make an appearance in courts that were geographically very far away from each other?
Yes, so that's actually one of the themes listed in the Rural Law Practice in New York State report on one of the primary challenges. There are 8 challenges that were identified as themes across the responses, and one of them was definitely distance burdens and technology burdens, which were things that really made rural practice particularly challenging for the rural practitioner. They call it windshield time, where you have to spend a lot of unpaid time in a car running to all these courts, and most of the time your client cannot afford to pay you for that windshield time. And also the technology issues make running an efficient law practice difficult. It's on page 9, Sharon, or Teresa, I don't know who's scrolling down, but on page 9, we see the distance burdens, the technology issues, with some supportive qualitative quotes that really demonstrate how a rural practitioner is impacted by that. And in general, rural practitioners spend a lot of more time traveling longer distances to represent their clients in various courts than an urban attorney, particularly when that urban law office is near to many of the courts that you would typically appear in front of. In New York State, we have this town and village court system. It's a little bit wacky and very different from what other jurisdictions experience, but these town and village courts are really scattered across great distances, and oftentimes, you're a Main Street lawyer in a small town and someone comes to you and they're like, I got this traffic violation, I've been served with this foreclosure notice, whatever it is, but it's coming from many different courts across the county. And then you're going to have to take a lot of time to appear in those locations. And again, it's just one of the inefficiencies of one of the challenges of rural practice in New York State.
I understand one of the other issues is the difficulty that some practitioners have in making a living, because personal injury cases that were once their bread and butter have not been going to them because of advertising and internet connections. Did you find that as well?
Yeah, so I've heard of this this complaint. It didn't really manifest itself in the survey that I ran. Uh, I did collect data on the practice areas. If you scroll up, um, I don't know who's controlling the dashboard, but on page, there's a list on page 3 of the practice areas that were reported. And actually, personal injury tort claims is only 8.4% of our respondents indicated that that was one of their top 3 practice areas. So that might actually corroborate this, this reported complaint that personal injury causes of action that personal injury clients tend to just go to urban locations because of the advertising. It's only a small percentage of the practice areas that were reported by our respondents.
Okay, now at this point, we would start talking about some solutions because some jurisdictions have been very creative about how to counteract this problem and perhaps ward off some of the problems with the aging of the rural lawyer. So we had all planned for everybody a discussion of um, the South Dakota project, which not only was way ahead of its time, but very, very significant. And we don't know the full extent that Chief Justice Gilbertson and Suzanne Starr are having technologically. We know they're working on it, and we still are hopeful that they're going to be able to join this program. We do understand that on the line as one of the participants that we have Denise Langley with the South Dakota Access to Justice Commission. We would like to at least talk a little bit about what's going on in South Dakota, and I'm hoping I can put Denise on the spot to talk about that a little bit. Denise, are you there? Are you still there?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Hi. I just saw your memo pop up in the chat, so. I am with Access to Justice, Inc. It is the State Bar of South Dakota's legal aid program.
Hello, Denise?
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
You cut off.
Okay, I am with Access to Justice, Inc. It is the State Bar of South Dakota's legal aid program. And what we do is we match income qualifying individuals with licensed attorneys in South Dakota. Individuals that apply through our program can qualify for either pro bono or reduced rate legal assistance.
So it's my understanding that within South Dakota, you do not have a formal legal aid program that's either an LSC entity or other funded entity that delivers legal services in rural areas. Is that correct?
No, actually, there are 2 LSC funded programs in South Dakota. One is East River Legal Services, and they are located in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and they cover Sioux Falls and the eastern side of the state. And then we have another LSC funded program called Dakota Plains Legal Services, and they have offices in different locations throughout the state, including on our tribal reservation lands. They assist with both state and tribal court matters.
Okay, great, because we had been told that it was primarily urban, that the LSC funded entities primarily served urban areas of South Dakota. So it's good to know that there are programs out there in addition to the one that the State Bar of South Dakota has partnered with the courts to provide. And again, we're still hopeful that that Chief Justice Gilbertson and Suzanne Starr will be able to join us and give us their success stories. I wonder if, I'm going to put him on the spot, Ray Williams can comment a little bit about some of the initiatives in Missouri, because they have also have a tremendous number of rural areas with the same sort of challenges.
Thank you, Sharon. We've worked on this project over the last few months to kind of bring some of the highlights together, and we are currently looking at some of these issues. I think the one key, as so many of your states have, is that we have a lot of our rural, solo, very small firm practitioners that are down the hill or down across the road from the courthouse that are retiring. And those folks are having a difficult time bringing new folks into their communities, in some communities at least, to replace those retiring lawyers. And it really does have an access to justice component to it. We see that in parts of Missouri, but not the entirety of our state. And I think that's typical of a lot of states. And there's a lot of economic reasons, these loan reasons, and other reasons that are causing this pressure. But it could become a really serious problem here in just another few years, as so many of these folks are starting to wind down without folks to come into those areas. I know other states have other situations. For example, Arizona and some of the folks that deal with great amounts of distance and windshield time, and some extraordinarily poor individuals that just have never had representation, sometimes on the reservations and things. And we've heard a few presentations over the years about those sorts of problems. But I do think this is a situation that requires ongoing attention. And you know, I think everybody would agree probably that if we could figure out something to do with loan forgiveness that would help these folks serve the justice gap, not necessarily those that qualify for legal aid, but that next step up, but those who can't pay full freight for their lawyers. You know, so many times, and I practice, I'm a solo practitioner in a very rural area of the state, we go to court and one side of the case is not represented. And that's common, I'd say almost typical at this point in time.
We wonder if any of the participants on, and if you could let us know through the chat function that you have this information, know of any states that you practice in, or whether or not you are aware of any program for loan forgiveness for people in rural areas other than the formal program that they have in South Dakota. Are there any of you who are aware of that? Oh, I see that, wait, we are very lucky we have our participants from South Dakota here. Unfortunately, you can't see them, but you'll be able to hear them. And we're so happy to have them with us. First, let me introduce Chief Justice David Gilbertson. He has been the Chief Justice of the South Dakota Supreme Court since 2011. And to me, the most amazing statistic is that he was elected 5 times by his peers to be Chief Justice. He's been on the Supreme Court since 1995, where he's been retained 3 times. And he's from the 5th District, which is the northernmost portion of South Dakota. Before that, he was in the circuit court from 86 to 95 and in private practice from 75 to 86. And we also have Suzanne Starr, who is the Director of Policy and Legal Services for the Unified Judicial System. Before joining the court system, she was in private practice for 10 years. And following her graduation from the University of South Dakota Law School in '99, she was a clerk for the South Dakota Supreme Court. Thank you both for joining us and fighting off your technical difficulties. And I hope you're able to hear us. and that we're going to be able to hear you. And please talk a little bit to us about the program that South Dakota has, how it works, maybe how you got there, some of your initial challenges and how you overcame them, and some of the challenges that you now have with placement as well as your successes. So welcome, Chief Justice Gilbertson and Suzanne.
Thank you. Can you hear us?
Yes.
Okay. My background is in small town northeast South Dakota. It's an Indian reservation town where I practiced for 10 years before I became a trial judge. And that gave me a firsthand knowledge of rural practice. When I came on the South Dakota Supreme Court, I traveled around the entire state, not my locale, and got to see that what I had experienced in northeast South Dakota was basically a statewide issue, and that was a lot of counties had very few attorneys, and the few they had were aging and were not going to be in the system much longer. When I became Chief Justice, I finally was able, in a position to do something about it. We're getting an echo on this end. Are you also the listeners?
Yes, unfortunately, we do have an echo, but
Can you
we want to hear what you have to say, so we'll suffer through that.
Okay, sorry.
Chief Justice, if you could mute your computer, then we'll just hear it on the phone.
How's that?
Still there, but better.
We'll try it a little. No luck. Should have. Well, anyway, getting to the situation at hand, it was very clear comparing a bar registry from 1985 and 2015 that we were rapidly going to have a few cities in South Dakota with attorneys and the rest of the rural area basically without attorneys. We have 64 counties in South Dakota, and 48 of them have a population of under 10,000, yet they all have courthouses that operate. And so we came up with the idea that the major problem, and it's been referred to today, was a lack of money to lure people into a rural practice situation. The main problem was, quite frankly, debt from law school. And so we were able to convince the South Dakota legislature to enact a program which would basically refund over a period of 5 years the cost of your legal education at a rate that a person would pay for in-state tuition at our law school. We're going to try to get rid of this. Hang on a second. Is that better now?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, that's great. Thank you.
Oh, yay.
Hello?
Yes.
Yes, we're hearing you.
Okay, now you're getting the feedback?
No, this is good.
Okay, you're probably sick of listening to me with that echo. Well, anyway, what we did was we got the South Dakota legislature about 6 or 7 years ago to pass a law that said that if you agree to go to a county of under 10,000 people and contract to stay there for 5 years practicing full time, we will refund the cost of your legal education at in-state tuition rates, about $13,000 a year. And you would get 20% of that at the end of each of the 5 years. And that money was raised in part, the state of South Dakota through our court system paid half of that cost. The county that got the attorney paid 35%, and the state bar paid 15%. And the first year we were able to sign up 5 attorneys, and we were then able to grow the program to where now of the 48 counties under 10,000, we have contracts with 26 of the 48 counties. We actually have attorneys in most of those counties practicing, and a few of them will join after they graduate from law school and pass the bar. I think the key thing here is to know that every attorney that we have placed in the county has succeeded financially. We have yet to have a single attorney in a rural area leave because they couldn't make a living. In fact, some of them are saying after a year or so they're overworked, and some have even brought in associates. There's a lot of money out there, and we have been able to tap into that, and we also try to talk to each county. They're all different. The classic quote from Tip O'Neill that all politics is local is really true in this instance. You have to size up every county. What are their needs? One thing we found very early in the program is that look in your backyard. A good portion of the people that have gone into these rural areas were raised there. They want to go home, but not all of them. We've got some people that were from out of state and wanted to change. I talked to one attorney and said, you can't understand how great life is when you don't even have to lock your door at night and you can walk to work. Cost of living is fairly reasonable there, and we then got the legislature to increase the number of slots from 16 to 32, and then came back a third time actually, and also had the same ability to place attorneys in towns of under 3,500, where maybe the county was over 10,000, but you had a very rural, isolated city, and we have now placed 2 in rural towns. Probably our major accomplishment is our most recent one, to make the program perpetual. When somebody leaves the program because they've done their 5-year contractual obligation, we can now go back in and replace that with another attorney somewhere in the state. So the program will have 32 slots. It will be perpetual. And we have really had no problems that we didn't anticipate. We've had some surprises, as to who would be interested and who wouldn't, but it's worked very well. And we usually have a meeting once a year where we invite all the people to come to a training event, and that's where I get to visit with them one-on-one, and they all seem to be very pleased. And in fact, we just graduated our first group of 5 lawyers that contracted with us, and out of the 5, 4 stayed where they were and continued their practice, even though they were under no additional contract obligation to us. We also try to set them up with other sources of revenue, such as being the prosecutor in the county, representing the school board, representing the city, criminal defense work. And in South Dakota, we have a unified judicial system, which makes it a little bit easier. And all 64 of our courthouses are wired between the courthouses, which cuts down on windshield time. With that, I'll turn it over to Ms. Stark, because she's really the boots on the ground. She's the one that goes out and sells these programs to the individual counties and then matches them up with an attorney. Most of them are probably from South Dakota, but not all of them. So with that, Ms. Starr, you're up.
Thank you. Well, like the chief said, our program, I think we've experienced a lot of success because of partnerships with probably the law school and the state bar. The state bar has a task force called the Project Rural Practice, and it's been very supportive, very helpful. One of their programs is an internship program, and so the state bar pays up to, I think, $1,875 for a summer of if I can get somebody to go into an internship in a rural area. So they pay 50% up to $1,875. So that's a program that's very, very complementary to the rural attorney recruitment program, where people they can kind of test the participant, and the participant gets to test the community, because rural practice, you know, it's not for everyone. So we really try to weed out the persons who are going to stay long-term. And that's how we build that's how we determine our success, is how many of these participants are staying well after the 5 years. A couple challenges that we've seen come up would be housing and finding employment for a significant other or a spouse. Those have been two of our consistent challenges statewide. We've been able to overcome them, but they are challenges. I can check in with Sharon. Do you have any other questions, Sharon?
Well, I was going to talk a little bit about, because the courts are involved, and that sometimes changing court rules are necessary in order to make life in the rural communities for lawyers a little bit less difficult. I wonder if you might talk about, you said all the courthouses are wired together, and to what extent you permit video conferencing. Maybe talk about some of the other rules that you have in place that make it easier for lawyers to practice in rural communities, so that people might perhaps think about taking them back to their own states and talking to their court systems to see if any of these can be put in place.
Our courthouses have been wired for probably 10 to 15 years statewide, and this allows for two-way video conferencing for virtually anything except a jury trial. You can use them for depositions. We use them for bond hearings because we don't have a judge in every county all the time, and they use it for consultation between a defense lawyer and a client if the defense lawyer is not in the same county. You're only limited by your creativity, and we really don't have any rules on it. We just set up the systems and told the lawyers and the people in our court system, go ahead and use them. And we unfortunately have a lot of blizzards out here in the wintertime, and that's highly attractive in the wintertime. If you've got inclement weather, it's not going to shut down your bond hearing. You'll just use the two-way TV system. It works great.
And what do you do about confidentiality if you have a lawyer consulting with his or her client?
It's never really come up as a problem.
So they are able to simply book use of the video conferencing, and then somehow have the privacy of each of the screens in the system to use it.
Right. You just go to the clerk of courts and say, I'd like to use the system if it's available at that time. The clerk will hook you up with the other county you want to talk to, and she'll leave the room.
Wow.
And do you find that a lot of the attorneys do take advantage of that, even in criminal matters?
I think more so in civil. And of course, in civil trials, you can even have the trial itself over the two-way TV if you wish to. It's only criminal trials in South Dakota where we don't allow it. But I've never gotten any complaints. Everybody loves the system. And it's also free. I should add that we don't charge, the meter's not running.
That's amazing. Sharon, can I ask
Yes, please.
Judge Gilbertson a question? So I gather that a large part of the success of what South Dakota has done, which, by the way, I've been a huge fan of and have been admiring since I first found out about it. You guys are hardcore trailblazing for the rest of us. So thank you for that. But yeah, you mentioned that you had to convince the legislature to offer the funding that subsidizes the placement of these new attorneys into the rural counties. And I'm wondering, what were some of the challenges that you had to navigate to get the legislature on board with this?
Well, the hardest one was that no state had ever set up a system like this, so we had to convince them that this would work. And it was initially on a trial basis, and they only gave us 16 slots. And eventually the court system took over the funding of the state share. So and that we get that funding off various searches for the public. So we have a guaranteed revenue stream. And the state bar, of course, provides us 15%. Probably the hardest part has been selling the counties that there is a need and it will work. And every county is different. So that's Ms. Starr's specialty, is that she's very adept at sizing up what the needs of the county are, what the problems are, and how an attorney candidate would work in that county. We did lobby the legislature to get the program originally passed. The state bar was highly helpful in that, but we have a lot of rural legislators, and in that case, we were kind of preaching to the choir.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the training that you give, because you're talking about individuals that may be right out of law school and are not necessarily practice ready. So what do you do in terms of providing training and assistance to those that you've placed through the program?
Our participants, probably about half of them go solo, and then the other half actually go into a firm with a more experienced attorney who's looking at retirement within the next 5 years. So that situation works out really, really slick. And, you know, they get all their mentoring and whatnot from that experienced attorney. And we also have a very, very close, helpful bar. You can pick up the phone anywhere, you know, and call somebody across the state, another attorney, and ask questions. And the bar is very, very helpful here. But we also provide, you know, as far as going out on their own, we do have a mentorship program that Bob Morris facilitates through the state bar as well. And so we try to get them connected with a mentor. I know I answer a lot of questions and provide forms and things like that. And the other bar members, really. I mean, we kind of let everybody know, look, this person's in your area, they're new, and they're pretty much welcomed with open arms.
One thing I might just add, if I could, is that a lot of attorneys that are facing that retirement, because these counties are so rurally populated, they know all their clients. They're their friends, not just their clients. They see them in church. They see them at schools. A lot of attorneys are not retiring, even though they want to, simply because they do not want to abandon their clients who they have just about a family relationship with. So for that attorney, that veteran attorney, to bring in somebody to take over his or her clients, they are more than happy to help that new attorney out, whether they actually go in the same firm or they just have an informal relationship where the young attorney can consult the senior attorney. The one risk that we have found out is we have a couple counties where we have no attorneys left at all. There it's tougher because there is nobody to call upon in that county with those legal skills to assist a new attorney, and they're kind of going in a little bit more on their own. But fortunately, we've been able to find quite a few counties where they're probably down to one attorney, and they may be 70 years old, but that 70-year-old attorney wants his clients taken care of and will do his or her best to assist the new attorney that's coming in.
That's great. How many people administer the program, and is it officially housed?
You're talking to them, Susie and I.
Really? It's just you two? Oh my goodness. You guys are angels.
And then another thing you do is you got to continually sell the program. Every year I talk to the legislature, called the State of the Judiciary message. I'll do it again next Wednesday. A good portion of my talk is simply to update them on the successes of the program so that you can keep it on their radar.
Have you ever had a county that decided it no longer wanted to participate?
No. No, we have not. We've had to be creative a couple of times. One county said, great idea, but we can't afford it. And a veteran attorney said, I like this idea so much, I'll pay the county share out of my own pocket.
Wow.
And we have 2 counties talking about combining and sharing an attorney. That may come to pass. We have a city and a county that have shared an attorney. So that's part of Ms. Starr's creativity and negotiating skills, are setting up those kinds of unique arrangements, because every county situation's different.
And are there any other states that have reached out to you that want to duplicate what you've done, to ask for assistance?
There have been states that have reached out. I don't know of anybody who's able to actually duplicate the program. I think a lot of it comes down to that funding, and getting, general funds for it.
We've watched with curiosity what other states have done, and they've got some very creative ideas, but at least in South Dakota, the essential part is you have to have the money to support them for the 5 years. If you don't have that, they're not going to go out there, and even if they did, they probably won't stay because the student loan debt.
Right.
That is number one.
Yeah.
So can you give us a round number for those of us that may be math challenged, from the initial numbers that you provided? What does this cost combined, the state, county, and state bar combined? What does this cost on an annual basis to do?
Each participant receives roughly $12,500 and some change per year for 5 years. So it totals out to be about $60,000.
Okay, but you have how many on any given year? So what is the cost in a given year to those that are paying for this?
You'd have to figure that out with your calculator, because we only pay half. The counties pay 35% and the state bar pays 15%. But how many attorneys do we have actually right now?
Right now, I think we have 21, and they're in all various stages of the contract.
Take 21 attorneys statewide times the $13,000 or $12,000 a year, and that's the total that's going to be paid 50% by the state, 35% by the county, and 15% by the state bar.
Okay, so if I'm doing my math right, you're talking about an outlay of somewhere around $250,000 a year in order for this, and that the court system is paying half of that, 125. Is that about right?
Yeah, we're paying half.
Yep.
Just trying to figure out, for those of us that may want to do a push to duplicate it, what our budget should look like. So thanks.
Well, the major unknown is how many people you're going to have in your system. The known quantity is how much each one's going to cost you, and what your share of that total cost is going to be. If it's the state, it's a half. If it's county, it's 35%. If the state bar, it's 15%.
So that 12.5 over a 5-year period, which is $60,000, that's roughly equivalent to your tuition for in-state tuition for the law school for 3 years?
Well, it's a little more than that. I think we added cost of living in there too, didn't we?
We did. It was 90% of tuition and cost of living, and I think a few incidentals. We had to pick a date to go with, so we picked, I think it was July 1 of 2013. And so that amount, isn't a true representation of what it is today, but we had to pick an amount and go with it.
And that's roughly about what your law school tuition is like?
Yeah,
yeah.
In state at the University of South Dakota.
Okay, great. And you just have one law school within the state, is that right?
Yes.
That's great. Does anybody else have any other question for any of our panelists? Anyone want to volunteer about any efforts that are going on in any other states? If not, there's a lot, I think, for us to think about, both the problems that exist that we need to try to solve, as well as some of the solutions that have been done by South Dakota or elsewhere. We did have one other question to you, Suzanne, as to what amount of your time is spent on managing this program?
Boy, it is a very labor-intensive program because it requires personal visits, at least to each county. And so then when you get a county and a city involved, you're doing 2 trips to county commissioner meetings and 2 trips to city council meetings. So I probably about 60% of my time. And then following up, we do a conference every year, and then following up with the participants and making sure they are feeling supported, and I can either answer questions they have or find people to answer questions for them. It takes a lot of time.
And when you you said that the support that is 15% from the bar, is that 15% from the Bar Association, is that right?
Right.
And do you know if the Bar Association just takes it out of their general fund, or is there some sort of direct fundraising that the Bar Association does in order to pay for that amount? Do you know?
I think initially they took it out of their just general funds, but then they recently did a COZAD what was it called? COZAD
The challenge.
challenge.
Yeah.
And bar members donated money for the fund so that they could sustain the program for a number of years.
That's great, thank you.
Yeah.
So as we're winding up our time, because we've allotted this for an hour and we just have 2 minutes left. First of all, I'd like to thank all of our panelists for coming out and speaking about this really important subject. And also to let everyone know this subject is so important to us that it's going to be the subject of one of the breakout sessions at the NCBP meeting in Austin. It is in the afternoon of Friday during the NCBP meeting. So if you're planning on attending that meeting, please look for this in one of the breakouts and bring your, maybe between now and then you can go back to your bar and just see what's being done within your bar and come ready to discuss them and share ideas with everyone else in the room. So thank you all for coming out. I hope you're happy that you spent the hour with us, and watch for other 21st Century Lawyer programs brought to you free of charge from the National Conference of Bar Presidents. Thanks.
Thank you. Keep up the good work, South Dakota.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.